Hello, and welcome to the Remembering and Re-Enchanting podcast. My name is Sara Jolena Wolcott, and I am your hostess on this sacred learning journey of unraveling, unveiling, and becoming more fully alive at the end of the world as we know it. In this podcast, we offer up to you, dear listener, 3 forms of episodes to support your journey of remembering and re-enchanting. First, conversations with amazing people. Second, storytelling. And third, myth casting. In this episode, we're going to bring you a conversation between myself and another amazing, fascinating leader in the areas of remembering and re-enchanting. Hello and welcome to the Remembering and Re-Enchanting podcast. I am delighted today to be joined by Alastair McIntosh. I first met Alastair in Brighton, England, about maybe 15 years ago or so now, when he was giving a talk on his book on soil and soul. And he told a story in a Quaker meeting house about the work that he and several others have been involved in the Isle of Eigg Trust for modern Scottish land reform, and a journey that in which they're able to raise 1.6 million from 10,000 donations, and to the community of the island was able to buy 7,000 acres at a knockdown price, leading to affordable housing, renewable energy, small enterprises, and eco-restoration, all under their own control. It was a story of hope. It was a story at that time, especially, that I had not heard before, and certainly not in the context of the Scottish Highlands. And so I was immediately impressed with this man and with the activism that he had been a part of, and that he was a part of my own Quaker spiritual community. And over time, a friendship developed between us. And I have had the pleasure of hosting him, of watching his journey in the subsequent years, and the many different things that he's been up to. And I don't keep track of them all because he's quite busy all the time. And I wanted to start this conversation not as like a classic interview style, but as two people who come from a tradition, or who are part of a tradition, amongst other traditions. We both have kind of multiple threads within us that we're carrying, but part of spiritual traditions that kind of trust the emergence of the spirit in the moment, and the beliefs deeply in continuing revelation. So we're actually going to start today with a little bit of silence and some prayers, and then go from there to see what feels like they're right, what is emerging naturally in this moment that needs to be talked about. And hopefully this emergent conversation will be supportive for our listeners, and might spark something for you as well. So again, thank you, Alastair, for joining us today. Yeah, it's really good to see you.
Nice to see you, Sarah, and thank you for having me on your podcast.
It's an honor. I keep almost hearing the strands of a song, and I don't remember how it goes. And the words are, you take the high road and I'll take the low road. Or perhaps it's the other way around.
Ho, 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 ho.
And I'm wondering if you remember that song.
Well, I wrote about it just recently. Where is it? Here we are. Ah, ah.
Mm,
Did you see that sitting there? I mean, I didn't know you were going to ask me that. Um, these are books waiting to be read or that I'm working on
mm,
immediately here. Let me see. Am I on screen okay? I might
yeah.
probably need to adjust it slightly. But that's the current issue of a literary journal, an English literary journal called Dark Mountain. And it's a special issue edited by Adam Weymouth, a former student of human ecology, who I tutored on the theme, the living land.
Mm.
And my contribution to it, see if I can find, here we are. My contribution to it is called A Sermon to the English on Land Reform. It's a bit cheeky of of a Scot to offer the English a sermon on land reform, but they did invite me, and I rose to the occasion, and I have this passage here. I mean, I've done it in the form of a traditional Scots sermon, Sarah, that has three heads and an application, three main points, and then what you draw from it, you see. Complete with all the psalms and the hymns and prayers and all the rest of it. But here is the opening song of praise, Loch
Mm.
Lomond. It was at the first Dark Mountain Festival in 2010, Uncivilization at Llangollen in Wales. The theme was time to stop pretending. Time to stop pretending that we'll fix the planet only with the master's tools. Time, as the apocalyptic Uncivilization Manifesto had put it the previous year, to make the pilgrimage to the poet's Dark Mountain. Paul Kingsnorth had invited me to follow on from Dougald Hines' fireside chat with George Monbiot. They offered contrasting views. That was to say the least of it. There was a bit of a bit of a disagreement between them, but I'm very polite here in writing. They offered contrasting views. George more the realist, Dougald more the idealist, both good friends of mine. It put me in mind of the Loch Lomond song. Two Scottish soldiers are in an English prison after the failed Jacobite rising or rebellion against the Hanoverian forces, the British state, in 1745. One is to be set free, the other to be hung, drawn, and quartered at dawn. And therefore his refrain in the song, or you'll take the high road, and I'll take the low road, and I'll be in Scotland afore ye. Or you take the high road and I'll take the low road, and I'll be in Scotland afore ye. For me and my true love will never meet again by the bonny, bonny banks of Loch Lomond. Woo! Well, it
Ah.
sounds quite cheery in some ways, but here we glimpse the old shamanic bedrock breaking through. The
Mm.
high road is of this world, practical, political, but foot-sloggingly pedestrian. The low road is the other world, the spirit path, quicksilver, but bereft of mortal traction. Hence the denouement, and let us join bucolic as our first song of praise, but me and my true love will never meet again on the bonny, bonny banks of Loch Lomond. So you asked why the song was in your head. That full essay is on my website if anybody wants to
It's
read it.
I love that. Let's go into that a little bit. And you kind of give the briefest of introductions to the high road and the low road. And so as you were just saying, the high road is, in this case, the high road is the everyday plotting around.
Yeah, yeah, the conscious world, the outer world.
Mm,
And the low road is the inner life.
mm,
And I think, you know, political discourse and economic science and all the rest of it, that takes place on the high road. But the deeper aspect that gives meaning to us, that sees pattern, that opens out fresh, as we Quakers would put it, openings of the way. That's coming from the low road. That's coming from what is usually in the unconscious. But the shamanic function, the prophetic function, the bardic or poetic or artistic function is to enter into that low road realm. Hence the saying that the function of an artist is to go mad for those who don't have time to, or those who are not inclined to. You know, it's a kind of, it's not the world of rationality, but it's just a world where deep realities take form.
Mm.
What about you? I mean, in your work, does that make sense?
It does. You know, it's interesting because often I think in America, I don't remember this is true in England or Scotland, that often we think of the high road as like moral righteousness and the low road as like slogging, like mean political,
Yeah,
you
yeah.
know, throwing mud at each other. Um, but it's interesting because in that particular in that high road low road comparison, we don't actually get to the underworld. We don't actually get to the transformation. You kind of have like moral righteousness, or you have mudslinging, which is frequently both of them can refer to political um, attempts at conversation, and neither one of them are really necessarily engaging with like that kind of deeper transformation, although ideally moral righteousness is connected to deep spiritual transformation. um and I and you've written a great deal about the necessity of both of the material world and the spiritual world working together, and of finding ways of connecting those two. And as you were speaking, I was thinking about like that time over 20 years ago now, when you were first starting the land trust that becomes this sort of self-sustaining and actually sustainable community on this island off the coast of Scotland. Um, did you feel like you were connecting both the high road and the low road in that moment, and during those times?
Hugely so, out of necessity. It was something that opened up as I walked the road.
Mm,
I got involved with the island of Egg, which is a 7,000-acre island, which acquired community land ownership in 1997 after a 6-year struggle against its private landlord. I got involved in that in 1991, where I was invited to become one of 4 trustees who set up what we call the Isle of Egg Trust, with this seemingly crazy idealistic vision that people could own and self-govern their own place, be democratically accountable unto themselves. And that was a very practical task at first of, you know, raising money, setting up a legal structure, getting people on board with the idea and so on. But precisely because of the struggle, precisely because we had to give birth to a new vision, or relatively new vision, of how land ownership could be, it opened up the inner life, helped greatly by the fact that the main figure behind the trust, the late Tom Forsyth, let me show you his picture here, just so you get a sense of the kind of person. There he is on the island of Egg there. Tom, you know, for people listening to this on audio, a kind of white-haired, white-bearded, crusty old backwoodsman kind of person, was deeply into the spiritual from an interfaith perspective, but he often quoted the biblical passage, "The stone the builders have rejected becomes the cornerstone. And also, unless the Lord builds a house, they that labor do so in vain." The sense that we have to be of service to a higher purpose.
mm,
And I think this is where what I would call spiritual activism differs from a lot of mainstream activism, in that you are serving a higher purpose than yourself. The more you can keep ego out of it and simply give service, the more effective your work is likely to be. And that in doing that work, you may have unexpected help. I was carried at difficult times in that by both vision and dream breaking into my consciousness. And you mentioned the 10,000 donations that we raised internationally that raised the £1.6 million, $2 million that bought the island in 1997. But the clincher was a donation of £1 million from a single donor who we call the mystery woman. I don't know who she is, but put it like this, that well-to-do businesswoman visited Tom in his little one-roomed bothy, his little one-roomed shack out in the wilds of Scotland, 4 miles away from the nearest road, visited him, talked about the trust, and shortly thereafter, I received a lawyer's letter saying, we would like to talk with you confidentially. I passed that on to the trust secretary, Maggie Fife on Egg, and to this day, she's the only one who is sure of the identity of the mystery woman. And, you know, I don't see who the person was that visited Tom because I think it, or we think it's likely that it was her. But you see how somebody like Tom, living a simple, very deeply honest life, close to nature, a life of profound integrity, can inspire. And that's your low road for you, breaking through into high road practicality.
It's so profound. You know, I remember the first time I learned about this, that this happened at all. I didn't know that particular story. I don't remember that particular story. And it's still very much with me, that it can happen. And just to help kind of situate this for our listeners who are involved with various forms of land trusts, it's very, what you're describing here is such a different form of a land trust because it deeply entails people being in it and living in it, in a way that not all land trusts do. But like, what is sort of some of the history in Scotland of villagers and common people and people living kind of very simple lives, having being able to control the destiny of their land and being able to have their sense of belonging to that land and have the land itself. What's the history of that in Scotland, of being able of that type of, not just the belonging, but the ability to help shape the destiny of that place?
Well, you see, in the Loch Lomond song that I just, my wife's going to give me a telling off at the end of this. She disapproves of me singing in podcasts.
I very much appreciate it.
I said, why do you disapprove? He said, because you sing dreadfully.
You sing from the heart. That's what matters.
But you see, the thing about that song is that it's located back in the Jacobite rising of 1745, which is followed by the Battle of Culloden a year later, where the Scottish clans were basically decimated, and the British state drove roads into the Highlands of Scotland and basically colonized the Highlands, and land progressively moved over into the hands of big landowners rather than clan chiefs holding it on behalf of the community. But I'm just back from my home Isle of Lewis, at the village of Lurbost, where I grew up. And you know, I was with 2 old school friends, both of whom are distant relatives of Donald Trump. And I was in a third house with a picture of members of the family meeting Donald Trump. What's going on there? What's going on there? That Donald Trump's mother left the Isle of Lewis in 1930. She emigrated at a time of great poverty and deprivation in the island. She took her opportunity to move to New York, where she met Frederick Christ Trump. given in a context where layers and layers of trauma had been piled on that family and indeed others in the island. So, first of all, their family, well, the two sides of Trump's family were evicted in the Isle of Lewis in the 1820s. And moving on, two, three generations, they end up with very little land in a corner of the island where many evicted families had settled under conditions of severe poverty. And then you have the First World War taking out 1 in 5 of the island's young men.
So just a quick to pause you there. So first, just like I love the timeliness of this conversation as when we're recording this, Trump just
in your election just now, yeah.
Yeah, right. Like Trump just had just got the RNC a nomination for candidate for president. So 1745, from 1745, when the English were invaded Scotland, would that have gone as far as the Isle of Lewis?
Yes, I mean, Cromwell sent an invasion force to the Isle of Lewis. It didn't last long. It got kicked out. But then subsequently, it wasn't just the English, it was also the Lowland Scots. King James the Sixth of Scotland commissioned privateers, commissioned so-called gentlemen from Fife, the Fife adventurers, to go and colonize the Isle of Lewis. So it was very overt colonization that was going on within the United Kingdom.
There's just about 200 years between the colonization of the Isle of Lewis and when Donald Trump's mother immigrates to New York.
More or less, yeah.
And during that 200 years, there would have been just many layers of poverty, and probably do you think there also would have been disconnection from the land during that
Well,
time?
you see, that's it. You see, my thesis that I put forward in my recent books is that Mary Ann MacLeod, Donald Trump's mother, moved out of connection to the community. She was no longer held in the basket of the community. And the young Donald, I mean, I've got Mary Trump, his, what is she? Here we are. Here. You'd think I had it all planned. It's just I'm working with these things all the time. Trump's relative, Mary Trump, her book on Trump, Too Much and Never Enough, How My Family Created the World's Most Dangerous Man. Now, she describes here how basically the Trump children were not cared for. They were just running loose in this, very wealthy house. They were certainly not held in the basket of the kind of community that we were held in. We were saying in the village the other day, some of us were talking and saying, had Trump been raised in the village in our village or in his own village, 10 miles to the south, he would have been out at sea in the boat. He would have been working the land. His rough edges, his ego would have been rounded off, and he too would have become held in the basket of the community and probably a great asset to the community. Instead, you've got this person whose narcissism has never been polished by vicissitude, as I have it in a line of in a poem I wrote, polished by vicissitude like pebbles in the sea. That never happened to him. And I think that the reason for Trump's appeal, I mean, I've just this morning I was working, well, here it is, hang on. There we are. Just this morning I was rereading parts of J.D. Vance's Hillbilly Elegy, which I find a very interesting book because Vance is talking here, especially, well, here, I mean, I've got the bit marked. It's about reacting to bad circumstances in the worst way possible. There is a lack of agency here, a feeling you have little control over your life and a willingness to blame everyone but yourself. This is distinct from the larger economic landscape of modern America, etc. I think that Trump's traction is because he's able to speak to a whole lot of people in North America who have come from historical backgrounds like this maybe have never integrated it into their family history, because the American story is always one of success, success, success. It's all high road. And there is not the integration of what happened to you. What happened to you that made you like that? And when I watch Trump, you know, it's like his mannerisms, his lengthy handshakes, that kind of stuff. He's got the touch of somebody who understands community, but has actually never had it. Because it's been, I suspect it's been passed on via his mother, possibly via domestic servants who she would have employed. I don't know about that, but it's somehow been passed on. And so he's got that common touch, even though he's got this huge disconnect, which allows him to be the kind of person that he is. So it's, you know, my book's
And like, so the
Culture's
thing you're saying
Pilgrimage and
about
so on, that I've
about
spoken about that.
all high road, yeah, like that that neither he and quite possibly and like his family in Scotland, like his mother's family, how do they see this? Do they, you were kind of touching on that, like do they see, like when you know them, when you talk to them, do they see the person
Yeah.
missing the community? Do they say like, oh, if he was from here, like something else could have happened had he stayed?
Well, the house I was in last week, literally just across the road, or short distance across the road from where I lived, where they had the photograph of Donald Trump, amongst many other family-related photographs. The man of the family said, nobody talks about him on this island. They're beyond embarrassed, because it's a very forgiving island. Um, you know, you wouldn't find any hatred of Trump, but you would find just not talking about it. Not talking about it. I mean,
That makes it
he
quite
he does
unusual.
not represent island values. So,
Yeah.
though he has this capacity to connect.
I know some that makes that island quite unusual. I know some groups in India who actually have entire like miniature temples demonstrated to devoted to Trump. So he's also reached the level of deity in some people's practices.
Well, he's an archetype, you know, he's a psychodynamic principle that speaks to people who've got that shape within them.
How do you name that particular archetype?
An archetype is a profound psycho-spiritual
Yeah.
principle.
So
Um,
this particular archetype, which one do you see?
oh, oh, um, good question. Um, he's a self-made man. He's rugged independence that says kind of fuck you, get out of my way, here I come. He's that kind of Wild West motif in the modern age. And he manages to persuade ordinary people that they too can be part of that vision without them analyzing that it's actually that kind of vision that screws them over. Like Trump's father screwed people over, like the rentier. Trump himself did the same with the university he set up and so many other business ventures where he hasn't paid his bills and so on. It's a trickster. It's a con man, all of that kind of motif. But you know what the allure of it is, it's the allure of gold, it's the allure of materialism, that you too can have this if you're like me, and that I will help you to get this. Um, that's the allure of the demagogue, in my view. But I mean, to give him his credit, Sarah, to give
Yeah.
him his credit, you know, he also speaks to something that, as J.D. Vance brings out so clearly, and this is where I actually have a lot of respect for Vance's writing here. I mean, I dog-eared a page I was reading this morning of understanding of that underclass dynamic. Vance says here, page 144 in my edition. That's about 2/3 of the way through. I consumed books about social policy and the working poor. Although I didn't fully understand these books at the time, as millions, and he talks about millions of people migrating to factory jobs and then the factories closing down. And then those remaining folks were the truly disadvantaged, unable to find good jobs on their own and surrounded by communities that offered little by the way of connections or social support, because the most dynamic of their people left the communities, leaving behind dead-end situations. In other words, the fabric of the community, the basket of the community becomes unraveled. And that's what made Hillbilly Elegy a bestseller, that it understands that dynamic that many middle-class people, many academic type people, many perhaps more Democrat voting people have not taken it on themselves to try and understand.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
I mean, when I visited you in New York, you took me to a community garden, and there was an African American guy running that community garden. We had a chat with him, and he made it his thing just to hold that space. I mean, it was a tiny space. It was, maybe a quarter of an acre, if that, and all kinds of plants growing, and he would just sit there each day, and the kids would come and play, and people would come with their children. It was a safe space.
Mm-hmm.
What that man was doing is he was reweaving the fabric of community, and that's the kind of work we need to do. That, if you like, is land reform.
Mm. Mm-hmm.
You remember the guy? Do you remember the place?
Yeah, no, I took many people there, especially if they were visiting from out of the city or even within New York City if they were visiting me, because it was such a special garden in the South Bronx, surrounded by a fair amount of poverty, a fair amount of housing projects, and a lot of tremendous community and people. Many of my neighbors had been in their homes for 3 or 4 generations, which in New York City is not that common.
Yeah.
So, and the histories and the stories within and quite a wide variety of community. And that particular garden also had a number of Taino and Native folks who were very involved with it. And they had the only standing sweat lodge that I'm aware of in certainly in the Bronx that I'm aware of. And that people use for sweats, that Native communities use for sweats for themselves and for their neighbors. It's a very special place, and so many people would come and they didn't know what any of the plants were. And I didn't know what some of the plants were because quite a number of them were not plants I was familiar with, and I had done a fair amount of gardening by that point. And yeah, it was a type of land reform, and it was a type of just like being available. Very much a largely volunteer effort, and very much they didn't own the land. And it's funny because as you're describing that, I'm also thinking about a community garden in like in the southern Appalachian Mountains, not that far from where Hillbilly Elegy, which I have to say, many of my Appalachian friends really hate that book. But they feel like there's so many better books out
I've
there.
heard that. Yes.
So many other books out there that do so much more to talk about that region. And but I know of another garden there that some other friends started on a relatively abandoned lot in the middle of a town, and that after 6 or 7 years in that place, they were told that to close the garden, because even though the garden was doing tremendous things for the community, they actually had to close it, and they had to close it in part because the landlords in the area felt that it was a quote unquote eyesore.
Yeah, we have that problem here too.
I'm wondering if you do, and I'm curious, like,
Yeah.
we often think of community gardens, and I'm using this as an example, right? But we think of them as it's not just about community gardens. We think of these community projects, which you and I and many others see as the very fabric of building back networks and social fabric and ecological fabric and land reform. And I think that we often underestimate that there are those who find them deeply offensive or deeply against their own worldview. And I'm
Mm.
wondering if that's something that you've come across, and how do you build in, whether that be resilience or at least working, knowing that that might show up if you have something that you think is quite beautiful, how to work with the fact that there are those around you who really don't want these types of initiatives to occur. I'm imagining they don't want them to occur because they um, they are threatening on some level to their own worldview.
Well, I mean, first of all, I think it's important to acknowledge that sometimes these places do become eyesores, that because they're voluntarily run, volunteer dynamics change. Sometimes these places get abandoned, become
Yeah,
beds of
that can
weeds and
happen.
so on, become places where people hang out and do unsavory things. Sometimes that happens. But you also can get the dynamic where the very idea of something communal gets conflated with communism.
Mm,
Um, the idea that everything needs to be privately stitched up and that common space is a threat to somebody. My friend George Monbiot in the Guardian newspaper today, he had a column which I tweeted about, and in which he makes a very interesting comment about what he calls the dullness of spirit of many of the very rich, the
mm,
dullness of spirit of many of the very rich. And he said, we should seek a wealth of community, of knowledge, of wonder, of life, of love, a wealth that does not impoverish others. We should seek not private luxury, but private sufficiency and public luxury.
mm.
So that idea that, privately you have sufficient, but leave the luxury to something that everybody can share. That's quite a threatening idea to people who only see the world through the lens of their own egos and their own neediness without doing their psychological or deeper spiritual work. That's, the worship of mammon
Mm.
rather than the
Right, which
understanding.
kind of goes back to
Mm,
that to the archetype that you were describing with Trump, that idea that if you vote for him or you approve of him, then you can become like him. And that
mm.
that has, which sounds terrible to me actually, um but that with that comes that kind of that Midas touch, right? That kind of that sense that you can, that and that lawlessness of being able to do whatever you want to do with no consequences. And that sort of desire to do whatever you want to do with no consequences, maybe even more than growing wealthy, is actually that has quite a profound heritage, I think, as I'm saying this here in the US. The
Well,
not, yeah, go ahead.
I mean, it's interesting. You mentioned that you first met me when I was speaking at Quaker Meeting House in New York, and I was speaking once in the Quaker Meeting House in a place called Chatham in Upper New York
That's very close to where I live now.
State. Is that right? Oh,
Yeah.
oh well, go and visit it. Go, go and pay it a visit.
Mm,
But I was speaking there, and there was this guy there. He was totally pup. He couldn't make any sense of me. And he says, I don't see what's in this for you. You don't seem to have any personal ambition in it, and so on. And I said, yeah, that's the point. And he says, no, no, that doesn't work here. In in this country, if you take that attitude, you're a loser.
mm,
And I said, well, I can, I was talking about my book, Soil and Soul. I said, I can show you a story that led to a community being in possession of its island, a story that led to a majestic mountain being saved from being turned into a super quarry. That's the kind of story that I can show you that I've had the privilege of participating in. What about you? What does your way have to show? And Sarah, it was a bit like the rich young man in the story of Jesus, when Jesus said, give away what you've got to the poor. He went away sadly because he was very rich. It
mm,
was kind of like what I was saying was bankrupting his his worldview, and he maybe wasn't ready to consider an alternative. I mean, at the same time, the fact he challenged me, the fact he asked a question, psychologically would suggest to me he was maybe beginning on that journey. He'd bothered to turn out that night. You just never know you just never know how people move in themselves.
Mm. And we don't know what are the questions that are going to turn people and help them
No, I mean,
go to a different
yeah,
path.
exactly. And, the way, well, we Quakers have this approach of seeking that of God in all and
Mm.
trying to draw out that of God in all. And therefore, you never give up on somebody. You may have to hold somebody at arm's length. You may have to constrain somebody to prevent abuse, but you try not to give up on them.
Mm-hmm.
You try not to. That's why Jesus said, "Love your enemies," which, in terms of non-violence, in terms of how you bring peace to the world, I think is the only way. It's such a challenging invitation to try to love your enemies, to pray for those who harm you. My goodness.
Mm.
But how else are you going to transform things other than joining by using violence, and so joining the violence and then becoming like unto that which you are most opposed to?
Yes, that is a very common story too. It happens so easily. Have you seen times, and we're talking about loving your enemies in a time, at least here in America, and I don't know, maybe I'm curious if this is happening in Scotland too, where there's such deep divisions, and it's cultural as much as political.
Hmm.
And it has as much to do with different versions of reality as it does to do with differing ideas of the good.
Hmm.
I don't think it's even primarily um, different ideas of what should happen, so much as it is different understandings of the nature of reality.
Yeah.
And I'm curious if you're seeing that in Scotland, and what are you seeing that's been helpful for people to breach across the differences in reality that different people
Hmm.
hold, or the difference, like
Hmm.
profoundly different understandings of what is happening.
Yeah. Um, George MacLeod, who started the Iona community, a spiritual community based at Iona Abbey, said, I mean, what he did was he got unemployed workers in the 1930s and took them up to Iona to give volunteer labor and skill to rebuild the Abbey. I'm simplifying the story, but it's
Mm.
archetypally good enough. Um, he famously said that only a demanding common task builds community.
Mm.
Michael Somare, the first Prime Minister of Papua New Guinea, in which I worked for 4 years, he said, we'll have our disputes and so on, but when you have to pull the canoe up the beach, everybody puts their back to it. And then
Mm.
you never forget the person who helped you pull your canoe up the shore. So I think we have to look at creating common tasks, preferably demanding common tasks that require community,
Mm.
you know.
Right, where there
Um,
is no choice except to work with the person next to you. And you can't
that,
just shut yourself off in your own house.
well, you get this strange paradox that if you do something for people, you leave them in your debt. So there
Mhm.
can be an unconscious resentment. But if you ask somebody to do something for you, you are then in their debt. And that makes them much more comfortable with
Mm.
you. So I would say, don't hesitate to go out and ask people to help with demanding common tasks in the community. And
Mm.
then once people have made a step of commitment, even a very small step, then they start to feel that they are a part of it. It becomes part of them. And so you start to reweave the threads in that way.
Mm.
It was something like the Isle of Egg. I was talking there about a rural situation, but just a mile down the road here in a hard-pressed area, I'm living in a hard-pressed area of Glasgow called Govan. A mile down the road, we have a project with a workshop where boats are built and a community garden and all the rest of it. And you know, that's all about holding what the American Quaker Parker Palmer calls spaces hospitable to the soul.
Mm.
Spaces where people can come and relax and be more fully who they are, but also where they ask each other to help each other. You know, everybody helps with the cooking and the cleaning and the gardening and fundraising and so on, depending upon their areas of skill.
Mm.
That's how you build community. That's how you build a sense of conviviality or friendliness. It's not a world where everybody's out to get you, but people will be on the lookout for you.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And building the boats has so many layers in it, yeah, in that part, in that area. It's also revitalizing something.
Well, we see our boats as metaphors of, Joseph Campbell talks about that threefold path, I call it departure, initiation, return.
Mm.
That's setting out in life as you come into consciousness, and then the initiation as you're rocked by the vicissitudes of life, and then the return, which is a cosmic return, the return to soul, when the river of life comes down and meets the sea, and we realize that all is one,
Mm.
that this is the ocean of love that we've always been a part of, but
Mm.
which we maybe haven't seen or glimpsed until now.
Mm. I was actually out sailing. I don't do much sailing. I'm starting to learn how to sail here in next to in the Hudson River, also traditionally known as the Mahitanatook. And there we were out quite late. I was out for a full moon sail, which was quite a lovely experience.
Mm.
And there the way the tides work is the Hudson River goes all the way to the ocean and goes all the way.
Ocean.
And it's a huge river where we were. It's 50 feet deep. And we're not at all close to New York City. We're not at all close to the mouth of the river. And the moon was not really coming out. She was hiding behind the clouds. But there was, when the tide was out, there was, and it was so still because it's a good 45 minutes before the tide comes in again. So it just is still like a lake, like a calm lake. And you couldn't, and we had just enough wind so that we weren't standing, the boat was not still. But the water, the stillness of the water, you could just feel I could feel my own body releasing tension, right? In the stillness between the coming in of the tide and the going out of the tide. And it just reminded me like how it felt so good to reconnect with the breath of the water and with that calmness that the water can have. And the water of the Hudson River, the Mahicanatook, is not usually a calm river. That one of the names, translations of one of the native names, is the river that runs both ways. Is not that it, the sense
Because
is
of the
vague.
title, yeah.
Yes, because the
Yeah.
tide, right? But it's like constantly in motion. But then they has these still moments. And it's something quite profound about being in the midst of a body of water that has both that constant motion and then to actually know those moments when even the river stands still.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. I mean, we have two inflatable canoes, and we take friends out and take families out, young folk from this community out at this time of year, catching mackerel, catching fish, and it's very powerful to see the effect that it has on people, how reconnecting it is. And, you know, they say the smaller the boat, the greater the fun. And with an inflatable canoe, you're very easily caught by the wind and tide. And so the only way to work it is to develop a very close knowledge of the wind and tide and really learn how to read your environment. We were out the other day, about 10 days ago, up on the Isle of Lewis, where I'm from, and we're on a stretch of water, an island called Pabby, which means Priest's Island. And it wasn't a windy day. The wind was only about 8 miles an hour, which is fine for our kind of boat. And there's a surface, surface wave, but not much. But there was about 6 or 7 foot swell coming in from the ocean from a storm that had been out in the Atlantic. And as we came round a particular corner and through a narrow gap between the open sea and an island, we really got quite a heavy buffeting because the waves, the ocean swell was coming in and hitting the cliffs, but then it was bouncing back. So you get what they call a confused sea, where you've got both the waves coming in and then you've got this backwash of the waves bouncing back. And it's kind of, you know, it was really important to to understand what was happening, and B, to understand, how to position the boat so that we didn't get capsized by it. But that is so exciting. That's why the smaller the boat, the greater the fun, because you've got to be more and you've got to be more and more tuned in. The River Clyde here in Glasgow, it's also a tidal river where we are here. And on one occasion, I was down just a few miles down the road at Renfrew, where there's a ferry crossing. And I'd taken a taxi down with my inflatable canoe on my back, and I was going to paddle back up the river and come home that way, you see. And the ferry was actually out of action. In fact, I ferried over somebody who was desperate to cross over while I was there. But I saw the ferryman working, and he looked at my inflatable, and he says, "That's a proper boat." I said, "What do you mean?" And he says, "Well, look at this. It's a rectangular box, basically, that ferries backwards and forwards on that crossing." He said, "But that boat's a properly shaped boat, even though it was made of plastic and blown up with air." And I heard his accent. I said, "Where are you from?" He said, "Eriskay, an island in the Hebrides." I said, "Oh, I'm from Lewis." So he put down his tools and rolled a cigarette and started talking. I said, how did you learn the ways of the sea? He said, "My father didn't believe in engines. My father only believed in sail and the oars. And when I was very small, he'd take me out in the boat and he'd seat me on the thwart beside him and have me put my arm around him. And when he would move with the waves, I would move. And so we would move. And so I learned the way to move in the boat. I learned the ways of the sea. That's how I learned it." My goodness, I mean, that was his father, but talk of the expression learning on your mother's knee. And Ivan Illich calls that vernacular learning. He says, just as we learn our vernacular language without realizing we're learning it because it's so integrated, so vernacular skills, vernacular values, and so on, are what we absorb from our community because we are so deeply a part of it, both the social and natural, and I would add spiritual environment.
I've been thinking for a number of years now that it's really important to start shifting our metaphors towards more watery, fluid metaphors and not only land-based metaphors, to really expand to deepen into the literariness of the oceans and of the rivers. And some of that actually came because I kind of had that I began to come to that realization in part because I realized the extent to which for here, especially here in New York, but I think this is true in many different places, my Indigenous colleagues and friends, the stories they all tell of the land are water stories. They talk about the rivers and the canoes and the creeks, and the transportation was what was through water, not only through land. And so, and to see the land from the water, but also because as the oceans are rising, like, and to kind of reconnect with the wateriness of ourselves and of our world. And as you're saying that, I'm thinking like how much being on the water and being part of the water feels like a really critical spiritual as well as literary and just enjoyable, of course, but it forces us to understand the bigness of the natural world in a way that often with a garden or something is less of, I don't want to say is less available because I don't want to discount any particular ecological spiritual experience. But there's something about like re-embracing the fluidness and not only the object of land might help us engage with land better as well.
Well, where I come from, we use a lot of metaphors of the sea. You see somebody's all at sea, somebody's lost their bearings,
Mm,
they've dragged their anchor. All of these things can be put or are used metaphorically. I think also traditionally certainly in Western psychology, you had the four elements: fire, air, earth, and water.
mm,
And often when I'm thinking about a person or even an organization, I'll think of the psychological ways in which those terms get used,
mm,
irrespective of whether astrology is valid. Um, Carl Jung, the Swiss psychologist, saw astrology as embodying a lot of Western traditional psychological knowledge. And in astrology, the water represents the emotions, earth represents groundedness, air represents communication, and fire represents energy. And I'll often think, there's too much airiness in this organization. It
mm,
needs more grounding, or there's not enough fire, or it lacks feeling. It needs more of the water component.
mm. I love that. Like I mean I do some work with some organizations sometimes and I think about that some, but I like the idea of really delving into the elements as part of the analysis and part of thinking with organizations and collectives about their strengths and weaknesses, like, and like as a way of helping people really dig into what's happening within a group of people. So I have this question for you on this archetype, since on this loose topic of archetypes, since we were talking about Trump earlier on, and since just in the last few days since I'm recording this, um, Kamala has become a very prominent figure
Hmm.
in the race. I'm curious, like, and this is very early on in this conversation, so we don't know for sure, but what archetypes do you see from your perspective there in Scotland, looking across the sea at us, at the US? What kind of archetypes do you see playing out in this moment so far?
Mhm. I think it's all at sea. You've got a deeply confused, choppy sea.
Mm,
You are floundering in the shallows, but at danger of tipping over the continental shelf.
mm, mm,
You are in a situation where public life has been dumbed down as it has here, and people generally are unaware of how poorly informed they are, especially of points of view that are different to theirs. My view is that none of us has a right to criticize another person's point of view, unless we can express their position as well, at least as well as they would be able to do it, unless we really understand how they see it from the inside. That's why I'm reading Vance Packard just now, so that I understand where that kind of stuff is coming from. What's the antidote to all of that? You need far better public education. The kind of stuff that the business-dominated world has stripped out of society. And which in theory the Democrats, I suppose, would stand for, of public services, healthcare, education, that kind of thing. You need that kind of thing, but you cannot just turn them on overnight. That's one level of approach, but the even deeper level of approach is spiritual, that you're dealing with the consequence of an incredibly materialistic society, a society that has never really come to terms with the historical trauma that it has both experienced and inflicted on other people, especially Black people, people of color, Native people. And when you have never had that truth and reconciliation played out, the neuroses that stems from that carries on afflicting the society. And so the work of race relations, the work of bridging different communities in America would seem to me to be paramount. And you can say, well, that's impossible. It's so huge. To which my reply is, remember that each one of us on this planet is only 1/8 billionth of a vote. Let us not get ahead of ourselves. We must be humble in doing this kind of work. And then perhaps, to use that famous Quaker expression, we might become patterns and examples that inspire others. But we can't assume that. Just, get on and do the work of love where you see the opportunity. And you will be amazed how quickly you start seeing the opportunities. You won't be able to go on the subway or the bus or anything like that without encountering opportunities to make community. Once you start looking for it, and once you develop that sense of inner legitimation to go about that.
Thank you so much for listening to the Remembering and Re-Enchanting podcast. If you are enjoying what you are hearing, please subscribe, share, and leave us a review. I am always happy to hear from you, dear listener, to continue finding ways to connect the disconnected and go deeper on your own journey of remembering and re-enchanting with your communities, your organizations, and your families. I invite you to check out our courses and other community offerings via the Sequoia Summon Via website. You can also follow us on Instagram, Facebook, and LinkedIn. Though I must admit I spend much more time working with really amazing people than crafting social media. If you want to work with me one-on-one or bring me to speak at your organization or family office, you can find out more at sarajolena.com.